Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all wherever you are in the world. And welcome to this week's edition of the Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace. My name is Jack Farrell. I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, and I'm going to be your host today. Welcome to the third and final webinar in our series with the One Earth Future Foundation on their approach to measuring program impact. For those of you who missed the previous webinars, OEF's approach extends beyond assessments, evaluations, and surveys to integrate robust outcome-focused. Oh my God, this is the first time I think I've ever had a frog in my throat at the start of a webinar. Apologies. For those of you who missed the previous webinars, OEF's approach extends beyond assessments, evaluations, and surveys to integrate robust outcome-focused monitoring systems into all programs from their inception. Through trial and error over the course of its decade-long history as an incubator of international peacebuilding and peacemaking programs, the organization has found value in this approach on multiple fronts. Today, we're joined again by Lindsay Heger and Sabato, who are Thursday Talk veterans at this stage, as well as their OEF colleague, Sean Duncan, for today's webinar on the nuts and bolts of generating and integrating a monitoring system. Just a note, if you have a question during today's presentation, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll address it once we reach the Q&A. To my OEF colleagues, apologies about the frog in my throat, but welcome back to the Thursday Talks. And Lindsay, please feel free to take it away when you're ready.
All right, thank you, Jack. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, wonderful, thank you. And welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, indeed. We're really happy to be here to deliver the third and final installment in this series about how One Earth Future, or OEF, does monitoring. Throughout the presentations, we really started with making kind of what we hope is a compelling case for why embedded monitoring systems in interventions in organizations actually is not only a impact beneficial thing to do, but also a cost beneficial and efficient thing to do. Last week, then, we discussed how we do it within our Paso Colombia program. We gave examples and looked through a little bit of our live dashboard during that presentation. And today what we want to do is dive in a little bit deeper into our ILA department. And if you haven't joined us before, ILA stands for Impact, Learning, and Accountability. It's the department within the kind of incubator function of the One Earth Future Foundation that really does all of the MEL types of services and projects. And today, obviously, we're focusing just on the monitoring aspect of our activities. ILA started about 3 years ago, and we've been developing these capabilities, though, really over the past decade, and was sort of formalized as such a few years ago. And I think at this point, we have these sort of lessons to share, and we're going to walk through how we actually do the embedding today. As we go through today, we'll talk about a bunch of different software and a number of different ways in which we've actually kind of screwed the nuts and bolts all together. We don't lay claim to knowing exactly which software are best for your project, and the things we'll talk about today are the ones we use the most. It's not a comprehensive list. So we've kind of peppered our presentation really with guidance about the major steps that we think are necessary and the things that are really important to keep in mind when you go through those steps. So before we get into those things, we want to discuss for just a minute what we believe are the minimum requirements in order to do an embedded monitoring system. And the first, and the one that in my opinion is the most important, is to have a crystal clear idea about what the impact of your intervention looks like and what sort of administration that program personnel will use. And that's key if you think back to our first presentation, because we embed a lot of our monitoring through the administrative software. We have to know exactly really precisely what it is that we're looking for when it comes to outcomes, and we have to be able to do it through the administration of the intervention, really from the intervention's onset. So those two things are really crucial. Secondly, in order to get this set up, we estimate that it takes between 80 and 120 hours of someone's time The initial setup includes kind of weaving the monitoring, the automation into the administrative software, and then pulling it out, collating the data, understanding how we'll do verification and validity checks, and at least kind of making a first attempt at a reasonable dashboard. And we'll talk a little bit about all of those steps in just a moment, but it's a fairly comprehensive first effort. But it does require, some updates after it's initially set up, and again, we'll discuss those in just a moment. The tools that we use here are the ones that we use pretty much uniformly across our programs. This is absolutely not a comprehensive list, but these are the three: G Suite, Monday.com, and Integromat that we use the most. G Suite is a really nice place for us to consolidate a lot of our data collection. Monday.com is the administrative software that most of our programs use, and so if you're familiar with it, our programs will, or the program staff rather, will generate Monday boards that describe activities and really what you can think of as outputs, and they may put specific types of information in there that are important for our monitoring efforts. And we use this other software, Integromat, to actually connect all of our say the Monday inputs into what we might have as a pretty comprehensive Google sheet on the other end. So these are the three things that we tend to use, and they are quite quite cheap. In fact, some are free, and some have pretty significant nonprofit discounts. So it's really a cost-effective way or suite of tools. And finally, a pretty consistent stream, about 3 to 5% of program funding, is what we have found is necessary to run our monitoring effort. And depending on the size of the effort and the age of the program and how scaled it is, and those latter two things really do correlate. We find that obviously programs that are just starting require sort of less monitoring. But as they grow, both geographically and in personnel, it does require a bit more effort a bit more of the program's funding in order to maintain the monitoring. So let's talk a little bit more about the exact architecture. And we'd like to think about the architecture really in 4 steps. And those are on the right-hand side of this particular slide, starting with data collection. Now, you'll see that all of these steps, data collection, automated collation, validation, and then visualization and audience engagement, those things all are have corresponding left-hand side applications that are listed. Again, these are not comprehensive. We use a number of different things here, but these are the ones that we use most frequently, and Sean's going to talk about these in just a moment. But these are 4 steps that basically all of our monitoring efforts follow. And the beginning is really to gather data from the field, from our staff, from surveys, and then to collate it, to bring it together, clean it, make sure it's in one place. And then we go through this, validation phase on a lot of our data where we go back in and we check and we say, okay, is the evidence that the program or the evidence that we're able to gather actually sufficient to indicate that in fact we are having the impact or we've reached the outcome that we think we have. And then finally, and we spend a good deal of time in this last stage creating visualizations and automated reporting that is really customized to the audience. And that could be an internal audience, it could be OEF executives, it could be an external audience, say our stakeholders themselves, or even organizations or individuals that we are working in partnership with. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who really is the mastermind behind a lot of this integration, to talk about how it's done and his experiences putting all of this together. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Lindsay. So before we kind of move into our data collection slide, I want to, just while we're still here, kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how we actually operationalize this. As you can kind of see in this graphic, really in that top line, what we're doing is taking data from 4 broad categories and funneling that data through our process all the way to the point where that data is visualized and then automatically reported to the relevant individuals and stakeholders. First of which you can see up there, we capture our field reports and survey data from on-ground teams using SurveyMonkey, and that's our primary survey platform, let's say. We also capture, as Lindsay had alluded to, employee reported information through Monday.com, which actually is the primary project management software that our programs use. Third, we also capture publicly available information in Feedly, which is a news aggregator and RSS feed application for various web browsers and mobile devices. Essentially, we can attach keywords and filter and sort news streams by those keywords and capture, let's say, when one of our programs is mentioned or when something happens that we need to be aware of. And fourthly, lastly, we use a program called Supermetrics really to aggregate and collect different metrics and the data therein from social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So as we move on to the next slide, as far as the actual data collection and data entry piece is concerned, there are 4 pieces of advice I would give you based on my experience building out this architecture at OEF. The first of which is automate collection and movement of data as much as possible to reduce the burden on your program staff. You will notice that, and this again, as Lindsay had alluded to, this will be a theme throughout the presentation. But while investing in automation does have an initial cost, it will pay you and your team dividends down the road in terms of time saved. Secondly, it's important to ensure everyone, staff, management, and evaluators included, have a really clear understanding of the metric definitions and what counts towards any given indicator at any point in time. One way to get the ball rolling on this is to schedule check-ins with affected staff members before and after the system is established to ensure buy-in. And again, as Lindsay had stated, you might need to tweak this a little bit. And fourth, something worth automating if possible is reminders for your staff for when they need to enter data by. And this can really serve as the start of the monitoring workflow from a staff and evaluation perspective. And quickly, before we move on to the nuts and bolts of collation, I want to turn it over to my colleague Andres real fast to talk about what data collection and data entry actually looks like within one of our programs.
Thank you, Sean, and hi, everyone. My name is Andres Sabato. I'm the Senior M&E Specialist. I work for the ILA department since 2018, and I'm based in Colombia. So I would like to introduce in a more detailed basis how data collection and data entry processes work in the case of a particular program, which is PASO Colombia. So the first thing to mention is that the type of sources and evidence that we collect, even though are wide and diverse, are articulated to the programmatic and administrative processes already in place, reducing as much as possible the burden that data collection and information gathering would pose to the staff, and particularly the field team. So first example of this are the invoices of commercial transactions of the areas and the cooperatives obtained when a specific product is sold. And perhaps here, I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the model of intervention of PASO Colombia, which basically are the rural alternative schools, the areas known as the areas, which are productive and educational hubs aimed at boosting collaborative schemes for the reincorporation process and the rural development in Colombia. So these invoices are one of our key evidence that we collect and which with that we feed the system. We collect, in other cases, reports of the partners that purchase the products, as is the case of Il Café and Nescafé report that you can see in the left side of the slide. Well, regarding leverage funds, the program submit formal documents such as contracts, memorandums of understanding, letters or emails from the organization or partner who is providing those funds. In the specific case of leverage funds, it's important that the evidence submitted comes from the organization involved. So we can validate that a third party is providing and corroborating the information reported. Another type of evidence comes from the internal programmatic processes of PASO, like the project charters of the eras, activation or closing stages. Basically, this is a project document detailing the scope of the intervention, objective, partners, number of participants, locations, and so forth and so on. Finally, the monthly reports of the field team, the extensionists, provide data inputs for the monitoring system as well, regarding participants, working days, savings, among other variables. The set of evidence is uploaded in the Monday.com trackers by the program's focal point and or the ILA team member in charge of the program, following specific criteria for raw data entry and disaggregation levels, which is, so to speak, the cornerstone for a robust processing and analysis of information. Well, so that we will turn again to Sean in order to know more about the step 2, which is data collection.
Awesome. Thank you, Andre. So yeah, to move on to data collation and aggregation, which is really the collection there and bringing down into one area and cleaning it. One piece of advice that I would give you is when it comes to compiling all of that data and actually aggregating it, try to feed it into one location. And what this looks like for us is we use a business process automation software that Lindsay had mentioned called Integromat, which is common to many in the business world. To basically take our data from the various sources, SurveyMonkey, Supermetrics, Monday.com, Feedly, and automatically input it into Google Sheets without us having pressed a button. Secondly here, second piece of guidance, it's important when you're setting up a system like this that you know and build in important subgroupings such as gender, nationality, industry, etc., really from the outset. And that kind of feeds into my third piece of advice here, which is one of the reasons that you do that is for your purpose of automation. Automate the cleaning and categorizing and really let the formulas, scripts, and queries do the work for you. We in ILA and OEF use Google Sheets as our back end so that we can have scripts and formulas that are doing most of the work for us. We can also adjust data formats and things like that as the data is being transferred through Integromat from a platform like Monday to Google Sheets. For example, if we wanted to change a column's format to currency or date instead of what the default setting might be. So moving on to data validation, which is the process whereby we as evaluators determine the validity of the collected data, I would provide 4 points of guidance. First, as much as possible, allow your evidence to be saved by and within administrative software. This allows you to create a historical record of evidence that you can go back to should a question arise in the future. And to the second point, while we are creating that historical record, it is also important to be aware of any privacy regulations or protection protocols that need to be adhered to. For example, if you're working with individuals in the EU, you would need to make sure that this entire system is compliant with GDPR and that you're not violating any privacy protection protocols. Third, and this one is pretty self-explanatory, ensure your program staff understand who will supply the evidence and what counts as evidence. And I would add as the third part here that they know where to enter that evidence and it's clear to them. Fourth, to continue with our process flow, as an example, while staff can enter and validate information within our system at any time, we send automated reminders like we do for data entry for validation checks, and we line them up with our data collection notifications. So on ground, what this looks like is on the 15th of the month, our staff receives an automated email reminding them to enter relevant data by the 25th of the month. On the 25th of the month, us and ILA receive and as the evaluators receive a notification, again via an automated email, that the teams have finished entering their data, and that data needs to be validated by the end of the month. So to kind of round this out, moving on to our visualization and audience engagement, on the first of each month, program staff and management receive an automated report with custom visualizations from the information and data that has been collected, collated, aggregated, and then validated. In terms of guidance on this step, I would point out really 5 things. First of which, and this is very important, know your audience. Different people are invested and interested in different things, and they want to see different information presented in different ways. As a result, I would advise building out different dashboards and reports for different people so that you can present and frame information in a way that's appealing to them. Secondly, to help in this effort, set up meetings with teams and get their input on the reports and how to make them more useful, not even just in this, but really throughout this entire process. It's important to be inclusive of everybody who's going to be using this. Next, create real-time connections between your data so that your dashboards are actually up to date with what's going on. I also advise making them interactive to increase interest and really allow teams to play with the data themselves and answer questions on the fly, perhaps without coming straight to you as the evaluator. Fourth, allow people to request changes in custom visualizations. One way we do this is through a feedback form that we developed. I would advise doing something similar and really embedding it within those automated email notifications and the dashboards themselves. And last but not least, make the information easy to find. We do this by sending the dashboards via that automated email, but this is the most important thing. If people can't find the data, they won't use the data. And so that is the real nuts and bolts of kind of how we do what we do in terms of our monitoring architecture. If you have any questions, I know we're going to talk at the end here. Also, if you have something that's very specific to your organization where you feel uncomfortable asking it in this kind of setting, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Sean Duncan at One Earth Future. And with that, I want to turn it back to my colleague Andres, who's going to explain about how these dashboards and visualizations are used within our program.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Well, in terms of visualization, we use a diverse set of tools and platforms such as Google Suite or Power BI. The goal is to integrate in the same space dashboard different variables, types of indicators and sources. We introduced in the second presentation, in our last presentation, the ERAS dashboard here at the left side of the slide, and its main functionalities. And in this session, I would like to emphasize the importance in how data is structured and processed to allow the identification of trends and a more nuanced angles for the analysis and visualization processes. The way in which raw data is categorized and stored is essential to compare and integrate different types of information. Disaggregation levels, for instance, allows a detailed analysis of activities and its connection with the specific outcomes, bringing a broader scope for decision-making process and deepening the analysis of the high-level or aggregate numbers. In this regard, the standardization of time and space variables, how the information is stored or will be stored and managed from the early stages of the design of M&E trackers and forms, it's important to boost the visualization and analysis options. Maximizing at the same time flexibility for data integration and transparency of information as well. Another insightful example is a tailor-made dashboard at the right side of the slide, built to track and analyze the results and effects of a specific communication pieces produced by Paso Colombia, particularly a series of videos and experiences of participants involved in a project aimed at fostering substitution of illicit crops in Colombia, developed recently by Paso. The dashboard allowed the program to identify key numbers upon views and engagement rates through different social media channels, such as YouTube, Facebook, and the program's website, allowing also to refine and adapt the communication strategies and have a sense of what has worked and what has not for this specific campaign. Finally, I would like to add that the dashboards facilitate analysis routines among the program staff and serves as a key management tool for the directive and executive levels. We will now turn to Lindsay, who will give us some final remarks of this third presentation. Thank you.
Andres, and thank you, Sean. Nicely said. I just want to remark on a couple things here in the last moment before we take questions. As the director of ILA, we've spent a lot of time putting these systems together. And at the same time, one thing we didn't talk as much about today, but one thing that really is key to the role and really the vision of ILA is the amount of time and effort that these gentlemen and a number of others have put into taking that data and then analyzing it for trends that suggest impact, or trends even that occasionally suggest missteps across all of our programs. And that's a great deal of effort as well, because ultimately we've set up this system to identify, really to bring this data to bear on creating more innovative and impactful programming. And we only do that if we have a system that's automated, that is gathering data that people need and want and use, and that we have folks who are paying attention to the patterns of the data and are able to speak to things as they are happening, which really is ultimately the goal and the vision of ILA, to provide this sort of information so that our program staff, our executives, are able to make better decisions when it comes to creating impactful programming. And so at that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack, who I think is going to field questions, and we're happy to take any questions, obviously, about today's presentation or any of the preceding two presentations. Really, anything's game. So Jack?
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you, Andres and Sean, for a wonderful presentation. I know the questions are already coming through, and Lindsay, I think you brought that out really nicely. You know, it's hard to get staff to buy into these processes if they can't see like kind of the end product, and being able to show them how useful this data is, how it's being used strategically to make decisions is incredibly important to get that buy-in. To our audience, now is your time to shine. We're opening up the presentation to your questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, and that will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on the DME for Peace Media Gallery, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. So our first question today comes from someone who's been participating in all these webinars that you guys have been hosting. It's from Steve Martin. And Steve writes, it's a bit of a technical data query, but do you retain base data in its original raw form, and or do you maintain a formal audit trail of all data modifications and transformations?
Yeah, Lindsay, I'm happy to answer that. We do retain data in its raw form, and we are actually in the process of really developing that log, let's say, of the changes to the data and those transformations. So that's been really our next step that we're in the process of working on. But yes, in terms of data quality and kind of maintaining that accurate historical record, we've identified that actually as a very important piece of the equation. So while that wasn't built in from the outset, we have identified that and are working on it actively as we speak.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. Our next question comes from Kim Miller, and Kim is the MEL manager at the Malala Fund. And Kim writes, thank you for this presentation, it was very useful. How long did it take OEF to set up and get the system socialized and running? Were you starting with a blank slate and you program, or were you trying to deal with existing systems and platforms, and how did you approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We started doing this after we had, we started this in kind of two ways. The first was with programs that already existed, because we had programs in existence before we had the system thought through or developed. And to be totally honest with you, that was a longer, harder sort of setup. Because the programs had been established, because they already had their routines, because they were already looking maybe even at some different data sources that were not necessarily consolidated. You know, that was a bit of an uphill battle for no reason other than we just had to, the logistics of it was much more difficult, pardon me. Though once programs began for those programs that began after we had this system established, it was a much smoother ride. And really honestly, at this point, we have a pretty good, really based on the guidance that you've seen today, a pretty good system so that once we get a program, once we know that a program is going to start at the foundation, we immediately before any stakeholders have any interaction with the program or anybody necessarily knows, or there's any outputs created, right? We start meeting with the administrative sort of higher ups, director, maybe an associate director, or any senior level management that have been hired. And we say, okay, let's talk very clearly about what your impact is, where you envision yourself. And we have a set of very scripted, facilitated discussions that really get at those issues. And then we start building our monitoring system around what comes out of those conversations. And really, I would say at this point, that's maybe a week or so worth of conversation that has to do with a whole number of things for sort of program startup. And maybe a day or two of that is invested in getting the information right for the monitoring system. And then there's another maybe week or so of time that my team in ILA will invest in actually setting up the system, getting the automated reminders established, starting to build probably initial dashboards. And again, this is a bit of a back and forth for, I would say, it's a back and forth until the program really starts interacting with its stakeholders and producing a lot of outputs. And when that happens, then we start seeing a lot more of the data populated, and we do go back. We make a very active effort to go back and forth with the program staff at all levels to make sure we know what they're looking at. A lot of times programs might start and say, hey, look, I want to collect these 50 data points. And it turns out that there's no way that those 50 data points that any one person, looks at maybe even more than 15. So we might scale back the amount of data. And now we've learned some lessons around that, and we don't collect so much when we start. But we do a lot of refining, and we'll do a lot of customization. I mean, really the thing that Sean mentioned about embedding customizable requests in the dashboards themselves is important, so that when people are on the dashboard, if they see something, you know what, they might say, hey, I would really like to see this as a ticker tape, or I would really like to see this different. They can actually put that request right there, and our team kind of amasses those on a Monday board and responds to them as they come in. So we're able to have a healthy dialogue with the team, with the staff, with the field staff, to know what it is that they need, and to respond pretty quickly.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. Our next question comes from Kay Abbott. And Kay Abbott writes, how do you assess the accuracy of staff reporting?
That's a great question. I'm going to let sort of Sean and Andres talk about it, but it is, we don't have a, we assume sort of the best of intentions. Really, a lot of our issues have to be around reporting the right things, and then making sure that everybody's on the same page. If people are not on the same page about the type of evidence that will sort of pass muster in this validation phase, then we might have to go back and forth a little bit. So if you have those discussions early on, you can save yourself a lot of time. Sean, Andres, do you want to speak to these points, because you two are actively involved in a validation check sort of at the moment? So
yeah,
Yes.
I agree with Lindsay there. You know, a lot of this is, you know, first off, ensuring clarity from the outset around what is going to count towards a given indicator and what evidence needs to look like. So what do I, as the evaluator, need to know to determine, for example, yes, you did attend that event. Yes, that high-level individual was there in the crowd. And yes, that conversation that you had with that individual was important to your work in X and Y, Z ways. And a lot of that is, yeah, the clear communication from the outset. And then also, you know, making sure that we're getting the correct evidence, whether that's through email communications or, you know, a simple meeting notes, something like that. And, you know, that we know, yeah, that everyone's clear and on the same page about what needs to be in that communication for us to be able to count that. And I would say in terms of if the concern is about, let's say, employees faking reports or something of that, you know, we work very closely with our programs. So just by nature of that, it would be very difficult for them to kind of pass something off that, let's say, wasn't totally true or didn't at least have a basis in reality. And that we could then go through the communications for, through the reports for, and say, hey, you know, maybe you did have that impact, or maybe we still have some questions about this. And if we did have more questions, or we doubted, let's say, one of those reports, my first instinct would be to go to the person who inputted that within our data collection platform within Monday and ask them and say, hey, is this the correct understanding as I see it, or am I wrong? And if so, could you provide me with any additional evidence to prove that this should count towards this indicator?
We do have instances where, oh, I'm sorry, Andres, I don't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, just one additional comment, and is I would like also to emphasize again the importance of the disaggregation levels of the information in order to, let's say, validate and also have a sense of the accuracy of the data. For instance, if you are collecting information on the product sold, as is the case of Paso Colombia in the areas, and you just have high-level or aggregated numbers on the amount, total amount of product sold, you will have, let's say, a kind of limitation to validate that information and to see how accurate that numbers would be. If you have, on the contrary, let's say, more disaggregated information, or so to speak, more granular information in terms of the specific product, the quantity of that product, the price of that product at local markets, and so forth and so on, you have much more inputs to validate on the one hand, but also check the accuracy of the numbers that the program is reporting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say, related to that, I think a lot of people will ask or have asked me questions about, hey, how do you know that this thing happened, that they're saying happened? And there are indeed some cases where we can't get evidence that the thing the program said happened actually occurred. We actually don't have any way of knowing what it is, and there's some good reasons for it. It could be that they're interacting with people that they can't sort of name in or provide evidence about. And if that's the case, those problems tend to solve themselves. Our systems are really set up, our programs are really set up to produce outputs that are tied to very specific outcomes. And so at the same time, while we're monitoring all of these outputs, we're monitoring the outcomes. So if we see that, somebody's self-reporting, hey, I met 30 times or 20 times with this individual or with this institution, right? And you'll take my word for it. On the flip side of that, if nothing is happening to the outcomes that are supposed to be associated with those meetings, then we have a problem, right? But that's not the case. Like I said, it tends to solve itself, right? We don't have kind of an incentive to, or people don't really have an incentive to kind of doctor anything that they're saying to us, because we are looking at sort of both sides of these equations. And quite frankly, we're working hard with the program staff to make sure that we're looking at the right sides of both of those, because they ultimately have the most sort of in-depth knowledge and the most specific knowledge, and that's where we're getting a lot of our expertise. So it tends to, those sort of situations tend to work themselves out. Jack, do we have time for a few more questions?
Time for a few more, Lindsay. So our next question comes from Carrie Huisman, who is at PAX in the Netherlands. And Carrie writes, how have you created mechanisms in your monitoring system to enable the consolidation and analysis of unanticipated results, be they positive or negative?
Jack, can you restate that question maybe one more time? Is that referring to unanticipated?
Unanticipated results. Yeah. So how have you created mechanisms in your monitoring system to enable the consolidation and analysis of unexpected results?
Yeah, so I would say, part of or I guess one of the flaws is it's hard to know when you're setting up a system like this what you don't know. And really, unfortunately, the answer I would have to give to that is to try and think about all those things beforehand and really embed them within the system. Now, of course, there are going to be uncertainties and things that are out of your control that may come to play later down the line and may, let's say, affect the intervention or what you're doing. And that is where we have to iterate and be adaptive in our infrastructure and our architecture. And that, at least to me, and I think our team would agree, is one of the big points of our system too, is we're changing it a lot. If somebody has decided that there is something new that we didn't quite anticipate from the outset would be important to monitor for the purpose of the intervention, but now it is, we can actually go back through our system and add that in or integrate that. And so really our solution to that problem isn't to pretend, let's say, that we have kind of a crystal ball from the outset, really to just try and be flexible and iterative throughout this process and understand that, interventions are somewhat fluid and things change. And as a result, our monitoring architecture will have to respond and be adaptive similarly.
Yeah, I would also add, Sean, that's a great answer. I would also add that from a sort of executive or administrative level, our program directors are meeting regularly with our executives and reporting on a lot of these sorts of things. And there's a sort of a formalized actually reporting process that they go through. And during those conversations and meetings, a lot of these unanticipated consequences or really exogenous or shocks, and of course we're all familiar with a lot of those recently, those get discussed there. And at that point, our ILA team is often sort of flagged and brought in so that we can make the adjustments that Sean was talking about. We can do it, pretty quickly, but a lot of times it starts with a conversation between the program director and our executives, and then we kind of come in and build the infrastructure around whatever changes might be occurring.
Great, thank you, Lindsay and Sean. I think that actually covers a couple of the final questions that came in around how flexible are the dashboards and how easy is it to make changes if you want to identify new indicators or need to add new data. So thank you, guys. With that, I think we're just about finished for today. A big thank you to OEF, to Lindsay, to John, to Andres, to Fernando, to Sean for your participation over the last few weeks and for sharing your expertise with the entire community. As I've said to a number of you before, monitoring is often overlooked and underthought by organizations. It's really, in the background. And I think you guys have done a great job in not only explaining your approach, showing how it works programmatically, and today showing how organizations can follow your lead and build these systems. You certainly put the M back in M&E, as corny as that sounds. And to everybody who's asked about how to for a sort of up close look of the dashboard, I'd encourage you to go back and watch last week's webinar with Andres and the Paso Colombia project team, because we really went in depth there. So it's a great opportunity to see how these dashboards work in action. Thank you to our audience for joining today's webinar. I know there's a lot of information today, a lot of really sort of juicy details on how you can build a system like this. So the recording is going to be posted on our media gallery this afternoon. Please feel free to return to it and share it with your colleagues, continue the discussion in the comments. And we'll be back soon with another Thursday Talk webinar in the not too distant future. And I look forward to seeing you all online again. Thank you again to the OAF team. Everyone, look out for each other, take care, and stay healthy.
Thank you.